I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine you're floating in space, looking down at the deep, inky blue of the Southern Ocean. And right in the middle of all that darkness, there's this massive, jagged white shape. It's an iceberg, A23A. It's beautiful, majestic, and absolutely terrifying.
It is a striking image, the fate of a giant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's drifting out of the Antarctic, heading north into warmer waters where it's just going to disintegrate. It's a perfect visual metaphor for the tension we're unpacking today.
Right.
You look at that iceberg and you think, we have to stop this. That's the moral reaction. But for the last 30 years, the counter argument has always been the
We
same.
can't afford to stop it.
Right. The classic environment versus economy cage match. That's the central tension.
Yeah.
This assumption that fighting climate change is some huge financial burden.
At cost that kills economic growth.
Yeah, that we have to choose. Do we save the economy or do we save the climate?
That's been the prevailing narrative forever. The idea that saving the planet is like eating your vegetables while the economy just wants to eat cake.
Right.
But today, we're diving into a text that says that assumption is not just pessimistic, it's mathematically wrong.
We're unpacking a brand new book, just published in 2025, titled The Growth Story of the 21st Century, The Economics and Opportunity of Climate Action. And the author is a real heavy hitter.
Heavy hitter is putting it mildly. Lord Nicholas Stern.
Exactly.
He's the former chief economist at the World Bank. If you follow this field at all, you know him from the famous 2006 Stern Review.
Oh, yeah.
That was the landmark document that basically put a price tag on climate change for the very first time.
And now, almost 20 years later, he's back with this new text from LSE Press. And the thesis is, it's pretty revolutionary. He's arguing climate action isn't a cost.
No, he's saying it is the growth story.
It's not about saving the planet at the expense of the economy. It's about building a new, more efficient, and more productive economic model.
Precisely. Stern is saying we're at a fork in the road. One path is the old way. It's dirty, destructive, and actually surprisingly inefficient.
And the other path.
That's the new growth story. And today, we're going to explore exactly what that looks like. We'll talk about everything from Roman concrete and AI to solar panels on German balconies and why African nations might just leapfrog the rest of us.
I love the Roman concrete example, by the way. We will definitely get to that. But first, let's ground this in some context. You mentioned the original Stern Review from 2006. What was the headline back then, and how has it shifted in this new 2025 book?
So in 2006, the argument was essentially inaction is expensive. The core message was that the cost of doing nothing, of just letting climate change rip, would be far, far higher than the cost of fixing it.
So it was the damage limitation argument. Pay a little now so you don't have to pay a fortune later.
Exactly. It was an insurance policy. But this new book, let's call it Stern Review 2.0, it goes so much further. It shifts the entire narrative from avoiding disaster to seizing opportunity.
Oh, so
The argument now is that the clean option is actually becoming cheaper than the dirty option.
that's a huge shift.
It is. Think about it. In 2006, green technology was expensive. Solar and wind were niche. But now, Stein points out that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels across sectors responsible for 1/3 of global emissions.
1/3.
And that share is growing rapidly. So the economic logic has flipped. It's no longer about a burden. It's about an investment.
Okay, but let's unpack this growth concept, though. Because when people hear growth, they usually just think GDP, money changing hands.
Yep.
But Stern seems to have a much broader definition.
He does. And this is crucial. He argues that we need to move from that narrow focus on GDP to sustainable development. So that includes health, education, and the environment.
Why the hate for GDP?
Well, think about when GDP was invented in the 1930s. It was designed to measure production during the Great Depression. It measures output, not outcome. So if you sit in a traffic jam burning gasoline, GDP goes up. If you get sick from pollution and have to buy medicine, GDP goes up. Stern argues that's not real growth. That's failure disguised as activity.
Huh. So how does going green actually drive this new kind of growth? Because Stern lays out these 6 drivers in the book. What are they? How do they make the economy better, not just, cleaner?
This is really the engine room of his argument. Let's break them down. The first 2 really go hand in hand. Innovation and economies of scale.
That's the learning by doing curve.
Exactly. It's the idea that the more you do something, the better and cheaper you get at it. We've seen this spectacularly with solar panels and lithium-ion batteries.
The costs have just plummeted.
They've plummeted down something like 90% in a decade just because we started deploying them at scale.
Okay, so things get cheaper. That makes sense. What's next?
Driver 3 is resource efficiency. Simply put, doing more with less. If you can produce the same output with less energy or less waste, you're automatically more productive.
This feeds into the whole circular economy idea.
Right, reusing materials instead of just throwing them in a landfill. It sounds like common sense business strategy.
It is.
But then we get to driver 4, system productivity. This is a big one, especially for cities. It's about how all the different parts of a system work together.
And this is where that Medellin example comes in, right?
Yeah.
I found this part fascinating.
Yes, Medellin, Colombia. They installed cable cars gondolas to connect the hillside slums, which were really poor and isolated, directly to the city center.
Okay.
Now, obviously, this reduced emissions because people weren't taking dirty buses or cars. But think about the economic impact.
Suddenly, those people can get to jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You connected a huge portion of the workforce to the economy. You reduced congestion. You made the entire city function better. That is system productivity. It's not just green transport.
It's a more functional city.
Right. And it's about people, which connects to driver 5, health. Stern makes a really strong economic case here. Pollution kills. It causes respiratory disease, heart problems. If you clean up the air, you have fewer sick days, a healthier workforce, and less strain on your healthcare system. That is a direct boost to productivity.
And the final driver.
Investment itself. Building all this new infrastructure, the wind farms, the electric grids, the energy-efficient buildings, that activity boosts the economy. It creates jobs, creates demand.
So the ha moment here is that these aren't just things we have to do to stop the icebergs from melting. These are things that actually make our lives and our economies better.
Precisely. Stern's point is that even if climate change wasn't happening, a lot of these changes would still make economic sense. The clean economy is just a more efficient, higher quality economy.
Speaking of efficiency, let's talk technology.
Yeah.
Because the book highlights some really fascinating contrasts. You've got cutting-edge AI on one hand, Roman concrete.
It is a wonderful juxtaposition. Stern argues we were incredibly lucky with our timing. Just as we need to transition the entire global energy system, we're hitting the AI and digitization revolution.
How does AI help climate action? Besides asking ChatGPT how to recycle.
It's about speed and optimization. Stern mentions AlphaFold 2, which won a Nobel Prize. It uses AI to predict protein structures. Stern quotes that AI can deliver scientific advance at digital speed.
So we can invent new materials faster.
Yes. New battery chemistries, lighter materials for cars. We can simulate millions of combinations in seconds rather than years. But it's also about application on the ground.
Right.
Think about agriculture. AI can help a small farmer in a developing country use their smartphone to determine the exact perfect planting date or exactly how much fertilizer to use. It optimizes the whole system.
That's the high-tech side.
Yeah.
Now, tell me about the Romans. Why on earth is Nicholas Stern talking about the Pantheon?
Because the Romans knew how to build things that lasted. The Pantheon is nearly 2,000 years old, and it's made of unreinforced concrete.
Wow.
The secret is that their concrete had self-healing properties.
Self-healing concrete. That sounds like something from a superhero movie.
Yeah. It does, doesn't it? When a crack forms, minerals in the concrete react with water to seal it up. Modern concrete tends to degrade much faster.
Okay.
And Stern points out that cement production is a massive source of emissions, about 8% of the global total.
8%? That's huge.
It's huge. So if we can use modern science to replicate that ancient self-healing tech, our buildings last longer and we pour less cement, it's looking back to move forward.
That is fascinating. It really highlights this isn't just about solar panels. It's about reimagining basic materials. Now, you mentioned farmers in developing countries. Stern devotes a huge chunk of this book to the developing world. Why is that the focus?
Because that's where the growth is. Most of the infrastructure that will exist in 2050 hasn't been built yet.
Right.
And the vast majority of it will be built in the global south. The battle for the climate will be won or lost there.
And this brings us to the concept of leapfrogging. I love this term. It reminds me of the cell phone revolution.
It's the perfect analogy. In the West, we built telephone poles, wired every single house for landlines. Then moguls came along. But in Africa, many countries just skipped the landlines entirely and went straight to mobile. They leapfrogged the old technology.
And Stern thinks they can do the same with energy.
Exactly. Why build a massive centralized coal grid, which is dirty and expensive to maintain when you can leapfrog straight to decentralized renewables.
Do we have examples of this actually happening, or is it just, wishful thinking?
Oh, it's absolutely happening. Look at Kenya. Stern highlights that Kenya has around 80% electricity access, and 90% of that electricity comes from renewables.
90%.
90%. Wind, solar, geothermal. President William Ruto is quoted in the book saying they don't want to trudge in fossil fuel footsteps. They're jumping ahead.
That is incredible. That is way higher than most Western countries.
It is.
Yeah.
And it shows that the old develop first, clean up later model is just outdated. You can develop cleanly from the start.
But this kind of innovation isn't just for the developing world. You mentioned something earlier about balcony solar in Germany. That sounds oddly specific.
It's such a great example of removing friction. In Germany, the government just cut the red tape for installing solar panels. They made it so you can buy a plug-and-play solar panel, hang it on your balcony, and plug it into a standard wall socket.
No electrician, no permits.
Minimal bureaucracy. And the result, 1.5 million German balconies now have these panels.
Wow.
It turns every apartment dweller into a mini power plant. It lowers their bills and reduces strain on the grid. It's a perfect example of how policy can unlock that bottom-up action.
That is so cool. It empowers people directly. Okay, we've talked about the opportunity, the tech, the growth, but we need to address the elephant, or maybe the iceberg, in the room. Why is this so urgent? If the new tech is cheaper, won't the market just solve it on its own, eventually?
This is where Stern puts on his voice of reason hat and gives us a really stark reality check. He warns against what he calls lukewarmism.
Lukewarmism, what is that?
It's the new form of denial. It's no longer fashionable to say climate change isn't real. Instead, people say, yes, it's real, but it's not that bad. We have time. Humans are adaptable. Let's not wreck the economy by moving too fast.
The let's wait and see approach.
Exactly. But Stern argues this is dangerous anti-science. The hard stats are just terrifying. We are currently warming at over 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade.
Okay.
Under current policies, we're heading toward 3 degrees of warming by 2100.
And 3 degrees doesn't sound like much when you're setting your thermostat, but for the planet.
It's catastrophic. Stern reminds us that the Earth hasn't seen 3 degrees of warming in 3 million years.
3 million?
And back then, sea levels were 5 to 25 meters higher.
25 meters. That wipes out almost every major coastal city on Earth. New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, gone.
Correct. And we are risking that within the lifetime of children born today. The book discusses the climate stripes concept, visualizing how a child born in 2020 faces a radically different life than one born in 1950. We are moving into completely uncharted territory.
And he mentions tipping points too, right? This connects back to our iceberg.
Yes. The danger isn't just a gradual heating. It's that we hit a tipping point, like the Amazon rainforest collapsing into savanna, or the West Antarctic ice sheet destabilizing.
And you can't go back from that.
Once those start, you can't just turn them off. They create feedback loops that heat the planet even faster. That's why lukewarmism, this idea that we can delay, is so deadly.
So we have the technology, we have the economic case, but we're running against a ticking clock. This brings us to politics. How do we actually get the world to agree to do this?
Well, Stern points to the Paris Agreement of 2015 as the model. He calls it a miracle of diplomacy.
Why was Paris so different from all the failed summits before it?
Because of its architecture. Before Paris, there was all this fighting about top-down targets, telling countries what they had to do. Paris flipped it.
Wow.
It combined a top-down global goal-keeping warming well below 2 degrees with bottom-up contributions. Every country sets its own plan, its own NDC.
So everyone decides their own speed, but they're all heading to the same destination.
Exactly. And the destination is net zero. Stern explains that net zero is crucial because the temperature only stops rising when the concentration of greenhouse gases stops rising.
Right. As long as we're adding more than we take out, the planet keeps getting hotter.
Precisely.
But politics is messy. The book mentions the political headwinds, and it specifically references the second Trump presidency starting in January 2025.
Yes, the source material is very candid about this. It acknowledges that a U.S. administration hostile to climate action creates turbulence. It signals a potential withdrawal of U.S. leadership.
Does that derail the whole thing?
Stern argues no. And this is where the growth story comes back in. He argues that the market reality, the fact that clean is cheaper, is now stronger than political hostility.
So the money talks.
The money talks. Investment in renewables is continuing because it makes economic sense, regardless of who is in the White House.
And geopolitically.
Geopolitics abhors a vacuum. Stern points out that if the U.S. steps back from green tech and trade, other powers like China will step forward. China is already dominating in solar, batteries, and EVs.
So the transition will happen.
The transition will happen. The question is just who leads it and who profits from it.
Speaking of money, we can't ignore the financing. Stern talks a lot about MDB's multilateral development banks.
This is the real nuts and bolts of the solution. The transition requires massive capital upfront. You have to build the solar farms and the grids before you get the cheap energy.
And developing countries can't always afford that.
Exactly. They can't borrow that money cheaply. So Stern argues we need the MDBs, like the World Bank, to triple their finance. We need to de-risk these investments so that the private sector will jump in.
It really sounds like we have the roadmap. We know what to do.
We do.
So let's wrap this up. We started with the iceberg, the fate of a giant. Where does Nicholas Stern leave us?
He leaves us at that fork in the road. One path is the old status quo. It's dirty, it destroys our natural capital, and ironically, it's now economically inefficient.
And the other path?
The other path is the growth story. It's clean, it's innovative, it's better for our health, and it creates jobs.
It seems like a no-brainer.
Logically, yes. But Stern emphasizes that the barrier isn't technology or money. We have both. The barrier is political will and overcoming what he calls market fundamentalism, this idea that we should just leave everything alone.
You need active leadership.
You need it to steer the ship. He has a quote about tides, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He references Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. There is a tide in the affairs of men. The idea is that we are on a full sea right now. We have to take the current. Stern's sobering reflection, though, is that we now have to do in 20 years what we could have done in 40 years if we'd started earlier.
We procrastinated, and now we have to pull an all-nighter.
Yeah.
Basically, we compressed the timeline, but the opportunity is still there for the taking. The growth story is waiting for us. The question is, are we smart enough to grab it before the iceberg's fate becomes our own?
A provocative thought to end on. And hey, maybe look into those balcony solar panels. It seems like the future is closer than we think.
Absolutely.
That's it for this deep dive into the growth story of the 21st century. Thanks for listening.